This book by Jonathan Sarfati is called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Refuting Doctrines on Evolution. Many of you have read Dawkins, a lot of you have heard about him. There seems to be a kind of a trend right now in the world of kind of a neo-atheism that is becoming quite popular, and a number of people who are getting on the bandwagon. It's very seldom that you hear anyone purport to present in a credible way at least the other side of the question and or refute Dawkins. Well, this is the point of the book. And am I pronouncing your name properly? Is it Sarfati?
Sarfati.
Sarfati, Sarfati. Yeah. In Hebrew, Sarfat is France.
Right, so Sarfati means native of France.
Sarfati is in Israel, if someone is a Sarfati, it means they're from France. But you're from New Zealand.
I'm from Australia and New Zealand, and my father was born in France, though.
Well, there you go. There you go. Any Jewish blood there?
That's right. I've got my great uncle was the first New Zealander to settle in the Holy Land, so all his descendants are still there. So I've got lots of relatives in Israel.
Oh, so in Israel, you'd be Jonathan Sarfati. Very interesting. You are a chess master. You were New Zealand's chess champion. I've heard that you can play 14 people at a time, blindfolded.
I've played up to 12 so far.
12 people. How do you do that?
Well, okay, every square on the chessboard has a letter and a number, so there's an unambiguous way of communicating moves orally. So that's what happens between us.
But is it not difficult to play chess when you can't see what you're doing?
Well, you have to remember where the pieces are. Yes, correct. Yeah.
You know, I was going to bring a chessboard here and play while we interviewed, but I thought, why would I make myself look like an idiot? Anyway, I've never met a chess master before. This is really something. You're also a Ph.D. You have a great background in science, and you write like a scientist. I'm very impressed. I haven't finished the book yet. It's a book that requires a lot of time. And you also have to read Dawkins, I think, to appreciate a lot of what you're saying here, right?
Well, I don't believe you need to, because I quote Dawkins extensively, so all the relevant parts are already quoted, so I wouldn't want to give him royalties.
Okay. Well, you know, there's three things that I'd like to talk to you about. I'd like to talk to you about species and kinds. I'd like to talk about bait and switch, and I'd like to talk about natural selection.
Sure.
Natural selection sort of being the cornerstone of the evolutionary theory. But let's start, first of all, with bait and switch. What do you mean when you start out by talking about Dawkins' predisposition to baiting and then switching?
Well, it's also called equivocation. What you're doing is defining words in different ways, but changing the definition midway through the argument. I mean, if I say my car is a lemon is a citrus fruit, therefore my car is a citrus fruit, that's baiting and switching. The word lemon has changed meanings. And this is what Dawkins does with evolution. He defines it as change in gene frequency over time, basically any sort of change. But if that's all evolution was, I'd be an evolutionist as well. No one denies that things change. The real difference is that the general theory of evolution says that all living things come from a single cell, and that cell came from some sort of primordial soup. That is the theory under dispute. But he uses evidence for change and says, well, goodness, these creationists can't even see change going on. They must be wicked or stupid or ignorant. But of course, that's because he's baiting and switching with the definition of evolution, and many evolutionists do that.
Now, there's also, it seems to me at least, with a lot of these people, the fundamentalist is in the middle of this as fair game. If you don't believe in evolution, you are a fundamentalist, which means that you're a marginalized, kiss your brains goodbye weirdo. This just simply is not the case out there, as I understand it. There's a number of people like you, very well educated, scientists, who are committed to what's called intelligent design.
Well, in fact, we go a bit further than intelligent design. Of course, intelligent design is what we believe, but we'd also go further in that we don't want to leave the biblical history out of it, and that's where I think the ID movement doesn't go far enough, that they have no explanation for not only creation but the fall and the flood. These are biblical historical events which explain why some things are designed to hurt other things and why some things have gone extinct. If you haven't got the fall and the flood, I think the ID movement by itself is not going to be enough.
And what about the, you know, I mean, it's just a given. I was watching a science documentary just the other day on Discovery Channel, and I mean, they just talk in just casual terms about the, the billions and billions of years of the age of the Earth, and how things have evolved, and you get the sense that evolution almost has a mind of its own, and things are developing, always getting better. The assumption is always there, and when somebody says, now hang on a minute, you're making an assumption, it's people mock because it's conventional wisdom, is it not?
Well, I think it's what it is, and there's nothing less scientific than conventional wisdom. I mean, look at Einstein and Galileo were minorities of one at one time, and they went against the conventional wisdom of scientists. Galileo's main opponents were the scientific establishment at the university. So science is decided by evidence and not by consensus.
Yeah. Now, species and kinds. Let's talk about that for a bit. Help us to understand the difference between the two.
Well, see, species is a group of organisms that can reproduce among themselves, but not with another species. So we're talking about reproductive isolation. One species should not be able to crossbreed with another species. But a kind could be broader than a species. Originally, we would believe that the kinds were one species, but after splitting up, sometimes two populations can no longer interbreed with each other, and therefore they are separate species but still the same kind of creature. So we would say things like lions and tigers would be the same kind, because they can actually make a hybrid. A liger or a tigon is a hybrid between them. So there's still some connection, but they tend to be infertile hybrids. So they normally call this tiger and lion separate species. And the same with the horse and the donkey. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, the one thing, mules can occasionally be fertile too, but it's not very common. So, and that's what we'd actually predict from the creation model anyway.
Are there species and kinds in the insect world?
Oh yeah. Well, you see, I'd say a lot of the so-called species in the world are not really species in the sense of reproductive isolation, because we find them actually interbreeding sometimes artificially. Sometimes even the so-called genera, the genus is the higher level than species. Several species per genus, but sometimes even different genera can hybridize together. Like a bottlenose dolphin and a false killer whale have produced a wolphin, and the wolphin had a kid of her own. So maybe they're the same species, but they've been given different names.
So when you talk about having a perspective that goes beyond the ID perspective, in that you have a definite commitment to the biblical story, what is your view of the ark? Some people will say Noah couldn't have possibly brought them in 2 by 2. There's just the weight of insects alone would have sunk the ark. You see it as kinds rather than species that were
Definitely. There. That's what the Bible talks about. It talks about the word min, which means kind. Species is basically a modern concept, and therefore we shouldn't read the term species back into the word kind. It's just reading things into it which the original readers would not have understood. And when you look at the size of the ark, 300 cubits long, a cubit's about elbow to fingertip. That's a lot of ark. It's a football field long. People don't seem to realize how huge the ark was. And then also that Noah had to take only the land vertebrates on board. And when you think of kind, even if you make the kind as big as a genus, there's still only about 16,000 animals all together on the ark. And insects were not part of the creatures brought aboard. They don't breathe through nostrils. The ark, the flood wiped out everything which breathed through nostrils. Insects don't do that. So they weren't aboard as passengers on the ark. So no problem at all with that.
The evolutionary reality, the fact that things do change, and you, as you've said, it happens within kinds or within species or both?
Within kind, because species is again an artificial concept. Species are probably the best way of getting the most sort of change, because you haven't got the reversion to the mean that you have when there's crossbreeding back. So that's why most of the change would happen in small isolated populations, which is what Dawkins says, and which is what I would agree with as well.
Now, when we get to natural selection, and this is a big one in my view, I don't know in your view, but it seems to me that you can't have evolutionary hypotheses without a commitment to natural selection. The impression that we get when we hear about natural selection from a Dawkins or from other evolutionists is that natural selection actually improves things by adding value, or by, which is really absolutely not the truth.
It isn't.
No. Like there's this this second law of thermodynamics. Natural selection is actually taking away from rather than adding to it. Have I got that right?
I mean, I don't normally talk about the second law too much, but see, natural selection is necessary for evolution, but it's not sufficient. See, creationists in fact thought of natural selection before Darwin did. Edward Blythe, a quarter of a century before, was talking about natural selection, but it's a culling force, as you say, not a creative force. It can only select what's available, and it does so by removing genes from the gene pool. In fact, Dawkins himself compares it to a sculptor where he's carving his statue, but he's removing clay. And natural selection is removing genes from the gene pool in the same way. So it's actually going downhill and not uphill.
So natural selection is not a creative force?
No, it can't be, because something else must create the material for it to be selected from.
Right. So over time, natural selection would reduce the genetic information.
It would. It would have to. So
if there was enough time, and I think you point this out in your book, if there was as much time as scientists, the evolutionists say there is out there, as a human species, we might have been obliterated.
That's a big problem, because we are getting all these harmful changes in our genes called mutations. They're typos or copying mistakes, and we get about 100 new mutations every generation. And the thing is, natural selection cannot remove them all, and it'll be